What's up, friends? So today I'm really super happy to welcome Mr. Etan Rosenbloom to the show. Etan is the founder, a blogger, and a social mediator of one of my favorite Instagram accounts, Etan Does LA, a project documenting the history of all 600 plus LA landmarks on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, it's been featured in the LA Times, Kiss FM, LAists, How to LA podcast, the LA Conservancy, and of course today, the Rogue Historian podcast. By day, Tom works for an organization that gets songwriters and composers paid for their work when their music gets played. And he lives in Valley Village with his wife and his kid and his cat. And so you know you gotta love that. Let's welcome LA to the show, where he's gonna talk about my favorite city, Los Angeles. All right, here we are. Etan, thanks so much for coming on the show. Etan Rosenbloom hosts the Etan Does LA account, which is, and I'll just go ahead and go on record here. It's my favorite Instagram account. I go and check out what you're up to all the time. You have committed to visiting all 600 LA landmarks. And as an Angelino, I think this is rad. I teach a course, a one-semester course on the history of Los Angeles, and it's always fascinating to me what's going on, in terms of how Los Angeles identifies itself. And one of the themes of my course is it's constantly changing, right? It's constantly evolving and constantly changing. They're constantly repaving and rebuilding and doing all that kind of stuff. So I really wanted to have you come on the show and talk about the history of Los Angeles in terms of its landmarks, its architecture, what have you. So, Etan, welcome to the show, man. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thank you for having me. And I'll give a shout out back at you. You know, it's been a long time since I've been in the high school history space. Probably since I was in high school myself. But I love everything that you're doing and the fact that you're making it so accessible and talking to the people, whoever the people may be, about how to write better papers and books you're reading and just how to interact with history more thoughtfully. So thank you for that.
Well, thanks, man. I mean, we make a good team, on social media, just out talking to people about this is something that I've been really into since, at least 2006, 2007, is just going on to the internet with the advent of social media and being able to talk to the general public, as opposed to, I mean, I've got a background in academia, as opposed to being kind of confined in that insular world of academia where you really don't necessarily talk to the public.
Sure.
I much prefer this. And it's accounts like yours, I think, that really help people grasp some of the subtleties of history that you might not normally see just walking around. And as you know, I mean, what's the population of LA County these days? 9.5, 10 million, something like that.
Oh man, it's funny. I know a lot more about the population of LA in 1920 than
Well, it's something like that. It's up there in at least the double digits of millions if you spread out for the entire county.
Mhm.
And I think the typical Angelino probably goes through their day to day without seeing, you know, underneath the veneer of the city, and you don't see a lot of stuff. And I wanted to ask you, LA is, it kind of these days defines itself. Well, first is the entertainment industry, which sort of defines Los Angeles, Hollywood, and everything. But it's also kind of, I think anyway, it kind of tends to couch itself as a city of forward thinking, of the future, of what's next, of what's new, of what's trendy, and all that kind of thing. And my question to you, the first question out of the gate, is in terms of landmarks, a lot of that, historic landmarks, a lot of that often gets sort of washed over.
Sure.
And so, from your perspective, what is it that kind of lies just beneath the surface of Los Angeles that is sort of hiding in plain sight? And is there always for us to see, but maybe we don't notice it with all the other stuff going on around it? What are some things that come to mind to you immediately about that?
Yeah, that is such a good question. I think when you conceive of a historical landmark, you think about the obvious stuff, the ones that have the plaques on them and have a historical marker and are in the guidebooks. So, the things that pop to mind are the Griffith Observatory and the Hollywood Bowl and the Hollywood sign, and even like some great architecture like the Bradbury Building or the Hollyhock House, if you're into that kind of thing. But when I've started investigating all of the landmarks on the National Register of Historic Places, I started realizing, like, hey, there's a lot of uh, kinds of history or historicness that I hadn't even conceived of because I just never bothered looking or being interested. So, there are entire districts in Los Angeles that are under preservation ordinances and have been added as whole neighborhoods to the National Register because they tell really interesting stories about how the city developed or how different groups of people moved over time. And honestly, that's some of the really interesting stuff to me. So like if you look at the 27th Street Historic District, say, in South LA. It's just back in the news right now because this church that's been there for a long time just burned down for the second time in I guess the second time in 11 years. And I mean, it's not the kind of place that a tourist needs to go. It's mostly a residential place, a lot of small, cute little homes, single family homes. But it was really important for Black families in the early 20th century. It was important for other kinds of European families that were moving in a little bit earlier than that. And then after that, you had a lot of Mexican American families moving in. And so you can sort of trace just the development of this part of the city and how demographics shift by looking at this one little area. There aren't any plaques around, no guidebooks are going to send you there. But historians have found that like this particular enclave tells a really interesting story. And there's a lot of great architecture there too. It sort of combats this idea that well-designed homes are just the province of, richer folks.
Mhm.
So, that's one layer of that under the veneer kind of historical landmark that I think is really interesting. But honestly, like even in the more ritzy parts of town, the ones that you're more likely to go to find to find your history, there's so much to see that you wouldn't just know about walking down the street. So a recent example is the Fine Arts Building downtown on 6th Street. Is it on 6th Street? Hold on one second. Uh,
It's back in the days when we had Thomas guides. We could just so easily.
Yeah, I know. I just flipped through it, right? The Fine
Mhm.
Arts Building is, I'm sorry, 7th Street. 7th
Mhm.
Street just east of Figueroa. And, there's a lot of like gorgeous mid and high rises from the 20s and 30s downtown. But this one, you go through the lobby or you go through the front doors and there's just this immaculate lobby covered in bachelor tiles. He's like the tile maker from Los Angeles
Mhm.
and a little fountain with children and like bronze statues of children playing in it. And it was designed to showcase local artisans. And it was supposed to be a studios that were accessible to artisans. Like this was before the Great Depression. And it's one of those things you just have to stumble upon it or know about it. And it's a phenomenal building attached to a lot of the major art personalities in LA at the time. Uh, and like it's that kind of thing that actually gets the most traction when I post about it. It's the ones
Mhm.
that are really hidden gems that are kind of hiding beneath the surface a little.
And they're not in the guidebooks. And I've also noticed that about other really super interesting neighborhoods that have gone undergone into, demographic shifts, like you were mentioning. I mean, LA is one of the most diverse cities in the country. There are so many. There's so many people here from all kinds of different ethnic and racial and religious and socioeconomic backgrounds that have all kind of swarmed here. You know, seeking opportunity, as a result of the boosterism of the late 19th century that continues on to this day in many, many ways. And we get so many different kinds of historical developments that are informed by those ethnic identities and racial identities and various other things. A couple of neighborhoods that come to mind, I think, are really interesting that nobody really talks about anymore. Sugar Hill
Hmm.
was a very interesting neighborhood, sort of in the central LA area, and also Boyle Heights, which has undergone all kinds of interesting shifts, over the course of the last 100 years. Starting as a Hasidic Jewish neighborhood and becoming more Latino over the years as it progresses, but still those traces are kind of there. And that's what I always find really interesting. And it's amusing, maybe a more recent development. If you drive down Fairfax, around Third Street, Sixth Street, Beverly Street, it used to be one of the most vibrant Jewish communities in
Mhm.
the city, and now that is slowly but surely turning into a different kind of vibe altogether. Skateboard shops, clothing stores, sneaker
Yeah.
places, but what I like about it is that they've kept the facades of a lot of those old bakeries, kosher delis, and stuff, and they're still kind of there. So you can see, you know, you can see the layer just beneath the surface, which I find absolutely interesting. You
Yeah,
know.
I love that. And sometimes it's no more than a facade, but
Mm-hmm.
the Diamond Bakery right on Fairfax, which
Mm-hmm.
just unfortunately closed down its storefront, I think last year. I was in there like 2 weeks before it closed with no idea that it was about to close.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking for Hamantaschen for Purim or something.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Cantor's is still there, and you still
Mm-hmm.
see a lot of signage in Hebrew and like thrift shops that cater to that community as well. Um, but yeah, those traces are so cool. And honestly, I find them even more meaningful when you stumble across something that's sort of uh, an indication of how things used to be. It
Mm-hmm.
feels like you're uncovering a secret, and I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's sad, of course, um, but that thing, whether it's a plaque or a facade or like a tree that somebody planted that's still there, it becomes like this totem, it becomes a monument of its own for sure.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there's a tree right in front of Hollywood High School. I think is one of those trees that you mentioned. They have a little plaque. I live close by Hollywood High, and so when I walk by a lot, I see that little plaque. That's one of those things that nobody would ever see in a million years unless they were
mhm.
the kind of person that I am. And I always find the monument. That's always my joke. And there's a tree there that I would think was planted in honor of World War One veterans that has been growing in front of Hollywood High School for
Oh,
a very, very long time now. So, um, it's cool to find these little things when you stumble on them.
there's another one right on the Arroyo Seco on
Mm-hmm.
the western edge of Pasadena. Um, and it's a tree, or maybe it was the location of the tree where Father Crespi, part of
Mm-hmm.
the Portola expedition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, he held like the first Easter service in Los
Mm-hmm.
Angeles. And there's just a cross that's erected right there, but I think there used to be a big oak, um, and commemorated the spot. And the same thing out in La Placerita Canyon, the Oak of the Golden Dream, where
Mm-hmm.
supposedly there was a Hispanic farmer who like took a nap and had a dream that he was pulling up onions, and there was like he discovered gold. And then and so he pulled up onions when he woke up, and there were these little gold flecks, and this was before the gold rush started.
Oh wow.
Still like got a marker there, and the tree is actually there, that they say is the place where gold was first discovered in California.
That's very cool.
So yeah, it could be nothing more than a tree or an intersection, or you know
Yeah, I mean,
skating ring.
honestly, those things probably seem insignificant to a lot of people, but when you start looking, I like to, find these little things, and then of course I run right home and start doing the investigation, and then a lot. Speaking of onions, the layers just continue to start to peel back, and you see all these really interesting connections. Um, One of the things that's been, as things come up recently in the news, for example, about kind of the uh, makeovers that LA get frequently. Something that strikes me is often controversial about taking down elements of the city's past that some people love and identify with in an effort to revitalize a neighborhood or to bring money to a neighborhood or just to provide you know housing and stuff for. I mean, it's expensive stuff. It's not like but I'm talking about like luxury apartments and various things like what's going on Sunset, for example. I think is an interesting story and a controversial story where they took down the Chase Bank on the corner of Sunset and Crescent Heights,
Yeah.
which was a historical landmark. It was a nice the bank itself. I mean, the strip mall it was in was kind of like whatever, but Pollo Loco was there and a McDonald's and a Subway sandwich place, I think. But the bank itself was cool because it was a kind of a nice representation of mid-century architecture.
Mhm.
Um, and it had that very famous statue out in front of it, that sculpture out in front of it, and you can see it in all kinds of things, from Doors, uh, 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 pictures of Jim Morrison and the Doors with that in the backdrop and things like that. So it's been there, since the mid-century, and people have identified that with a long time, and now it's gone.
Yeah.
In the name of, I don't know what you call it, progress or development or what have you. It can be controversial. What are your thoughts on the controversies surrounding these things? Because I'm interested in what you have to say, and then I have a follow up question about that.
Sure. Well, that specific example you gave is near and dear to my heart. I've worked like 2 blocks away from that intersection for the past 18 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was there back when the bank was there, and that used to be my El Pollo Loco and where my dentist was.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to, avoid the line of cars going into that ungodly narrow McDonald's drive-through.
Right, with the hairpin curve right as you went in there.
Exactly. Um, so that one meant a lot to me. And honestly, like before it was demolished, I didn't really know about the significance of that Lytton bank that turned into Chase.
Right.
But in reading about it and looking at the old pictures, it's actually really significant as a
Mm-hmm.
bank. It was designed by this guy, Kurt Meyer, who I didn't realize this, but um, I think he had a large part to play in the redevelopment of downtown later. Um, like during the community redevelopment agency phase in the 70s and 80s, where things started to look like they do now. But even before that bank was there, that was the Gardens of Allah, this
Mm-hmm.
infamous, I guess, for bungalow hotel complex, where you used to go if you were part of the Hollywood elite and wanted some discretion and maybe to have an affair with somebody in the bungalow, down the road, and get drunk and jump into the pool. So, like you were saying about the peeling the onion, there's a lot of layers of history there. And what's happened there is really sad. It's like there was a big developer who wanted to bring in Frank Gehry and put up a massive, multi-use complex, and then they ran out of money, and so it's just a dirt lot right now.
Mm-hmm.
So, to answer your question, I my take sort of rides a line between horror and just kind of throwing up my hands and saying, it's progress. I wouldn't consider myself a hardcore preservationist who thinks that every old building needs to be saved, or even that every important building needs to be saved. Uh, but when something happens like that, and it's just in the name of capital, like there wasn't even a good plan, uh, or a financially solvent plan
Mm-hmm.
to develop that corner, it just feels like this empty loss, you know? And especially when this wasn't happening there, but especially when you get rid of affordable housing, in the
Right.
name of much less affordable housing or
Mm-hmm.
just another, boring mixed use complex.
Mm-hmm.
That was a community hub there. Like I don't go to McDonald's or El Pollo Loco that often, but they were always packed whenever I was in
Mm-hmm.
there. There were workers, construction workers that would go in and eat. And my dentist office was upstairs. There were people that, took karate classes at the martial arts place upstairs.
Right.
So it is definitely a loss, a local loss when something like that happens. Um, Look, I recognize that like cities can't develop if everything stays stagnant and if
Mm-hmm.
all the infrastructure and all the buildings stay exactly the same. But there needs to be some kind of sensible balance where the stuff that gives a neighborhood its character is can be preserved. The things that make people want to go there can be preserved. And the things that make sense to live there.
Right.
Uh, um, while still, you know, keeping up with other places and advancing as a civilization.
Right. Well, you totally anticipated my follow-up question because I was going to ask you about the Gardens of Allah
Mm,
that sort of predated the bank and the community center or the McDonald's and Pollo Loco and all that area. Because one of the things that comes up a lot when I talk about the constant reimagination of Los Angeles and these different neighborhoods is that this is something that is kind of, I mean, in many ways, it's sort of part of LA's character, I think, to constantly reinvent itself, to constantly remake itself. And while it is, I think, sad that these, especially if it's a community hub, as you described, kind of go away. For what reason? There's just a big dirt lot there now, and it's been that way for about a year,
yeah.
right? Is this really just part of the evolution of the city? The Gardens of Allah must have been a really cool place, and I've heard stories about F. Scott Fitzgerald there, and and various other people that just kind of like go out there and make that their home base. Who was I reading about that was there just recently? I can't remember. Um, was it Steve M. Woodward or something? A famous historian that got involved in. I can't remember who it was. I'm probably wrong about that, but a famous historian who got involved in screen. Oh, damn it, that wasn't who it was. But anyway, would hang out at the gardens. So I can't. Oh, I'm losing my mind as I get older. Um, but it must have been a cool place, and that was leveled, and then they put that other thing there that the people who loved the Gardens of Allah was probably an eyesore. So is it really just part of Ellie's character to do this? And I think you make a good point about you can't preserve everything,
Right.
right? But on the other hand, I understand what you're saying. I mean, that was a kind of a vital intersection for a lot of people. And you were saying people who worked in the neighborhood would go there to eat lunch and stuff and take their classes there and stuff. And now that's gone, and there's really nothing replacing it. So what do you do in that case? What's the story? I think you make a nice made a nice comment about you have to strike a balance.
It's so tough. And I mean, politics, of course, comes into play here as well, because there's every week there's another building that's being threatened demolition, and we're trying to get it locally landmarked, but there's a some city council member or elected official who's standing in the way for some reason.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times it's that that person has a relationship with a developer who wants to use, the property for something else. So, this almost happened with the Morris Kite House. I
Mm-hmm.
want to say it was late 2022, early 2023. Anyway, it was a craftsman home in the MacArthur Park area.
Mm-hmm.
It was the home base of Morris Kite, who was like a crucially important gay rights activist in LA in the 60s and 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was his home, but it was also like the home base of the LA chapter of the Gay Liberation Front. And
Mm-hmm.
so they had clinics there, they did strategy sessions. Um, and the owner of the property, I get the sense, was trying to get rid of it and build something else. And thankfully it didn't end up happening, but for a while it seemed like the councilwoman who represented that district was trying to sort of like minimize the importance of the house.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that was one victory, but it's just an example of how politics can play into this. I understand, like, when you look at what happened to all the single family homes in Hollywood,
Mm-hmm.
in, the 1920s, where you have this influx of people coming in. The city is like doubling in population at least every decade. You need to build denser housing.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes sense that there were parts of the city that were zoned for single family houses, and they were like, all right, maybe let's change that a bit, get rid of some of the single family homes, build bungalow courts or like small scale apartment buildings. Um, and then of course the suburban sprawl of the 50s, it's just like you have more people coming in, you need a place for them to live. Uh, we're at a point where a lot of the main neighborhoods in LA are pretty dense.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and nobody wants an ugly apartment complex that's going to like ruin the view from their patio or balcony, of course. But there are ways of bringing in new kinds of housing or new ideas of housing that uh, can keep with the spirit of a neighborhood, but still allow for more people to live there. Sometimes they call it gentle density.
Hmm.
So you instead on a plot where there used to be a single family home, you build a bungalow court that has like 6 units on the same amount of land, but each of them is detached and has a little bit of privacy. Um,
Hmm.
do that instead of building an apartment high rise.
Hmm. Well, I know a lot in legal terms. A lot of times, people get in front of apartment high rises for the sake of affordable housing because most of these aren't really uh, aren't really developed for lower income families. These are developed for more affluent individuals, couples, small families, what have you. And so if there's legal procedures where you can stand in front of that in the name of the development of more affordable housing. Is that something is that right, or am I misreading that?
But explain it again. There's
From what I understand, that a lot of buildings, a lot of new construction gets put through the legal paces because they're not developed for affordable housing. They're developed for more affluent, and so that don't they don't get constructed because of that,
right.
right? And so construction gets the kibosh gets put on it.
I think you're right. I don't know all the legal intricacies, but
Mm-hmm.
I remember that obviously there's a need for affordable housing here.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember voting for something on the ballot a few years back
Mm-hmm.
that was basically a mandate that, new construction has to require some kind of affordable housing element to it. Um, but I think from a historical perspective, it's been really interesting for me to see how certain styles of buildings came about because of new laws coming into place
Mm-hmm.
about housing. So I've done a deep dive on bungalow courts in Pasadena. There are something like 30 of them that are on the National Register,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and a lot of them have disappeared over the years. But the one of the main reasons why you don't see a lot of bungalow courts after the 1930s is because there were new ordinances about how much parking that you needed to have per unit per lot. And something like a bungalow court where there might not be any parking provided, or you might have a few spaces in the back, or the earliest ones didn't have any parking at all because they were
Mm-hmm.
from the horse and buggy era.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that entire genre of building just kind of disappeared. And that's when you start getting, dingbat apartments that have the parking sort of like
Right.
under the actual
Right.
housing.
You kind of
Oh,
kind of go under like that. Yeah.
exactly. Exactly. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, these laws and attempts to like account for density uh sort of by legal mandate,
Mm-hmm.
they have real impacts on what our buildings look like.
So how does one go about getting an apartment building or a house or any other kind of structure on the National Register?
That's a great question. So what I like to say is that anything that's on the National Register needs a champion. There isn't like a government body in Washington that is pointing at the things that it likes or designates as historic and then just sort of adding it because they want to. It starts at a local level. So it's
Mm-hmm.
usually a property owner or a historian or a historical society. There are professional researchers that will do this also. And so they prepare a very standardized form that you can get from the National Park Service that oversees the whole thing. You fill it out, and the first step is you send it to the state historic preservation office in whatever state you're in. And if they give it the thumbs up, they forward it onto the feds. And then
Mm-hmm.
there's a months long process where they'll evaluate it. And sometimes they say yes, sometimes they say no. And then
What is it that is the determining factor on something? Okay, it has to be more than it's just an old house. It has to have some. Does it have to have some historical significance?
Yes, but the way that they interpret historic significance is, it's very broad. So
Hmm.
there is a bunch of criteria that they'll apply. Uh, it could be that it is architecturally significant, like the building itself is a great example of a certain style
Hmm.
that sort of typifies that era and that time, or that it's like a sterling example of a master craftsperson, an architect or a tile maker or a landscape designer or something like that. So that's one area. It could also be really good at telling the story of uh, a, a group of people that came through, Los Angeles, let's say.
Hmm.
So, the example that I was giving before of the 27th Street Historic District, architecturally, they're not particularly significant houses, but the people that lived there, um, and the people that live there are not famous people either, for the most
Hmm.
part. There are some exceptions. But if this is a great case study to look at for explaining how people moved through the city, then it might be a great candidate for the National Register. There are also some other criteria. Sometimes if it was associated with a really important person, like the Morris Kite example I gave, or there's um, there's a house that a famous black actor, Eddie Rochester Anderson, lived in, for example. Um, that's the first one that came to mind, but there are a lot of other examples too in Los
Hmm.
Angeles. Famous personages have lived there, and if that's part of the story, then that could weigh heavily as well. Um, and yeah, so there are other like more technical criteria that they'll use. Um, but generally it's got to be fairly old. The standard is 50 years, but that's not like written in stone. You can get
Hmm.
exceptions to that 50-year rule for sure. Um, and it's got to be also uh, well preserved. So they look at, I think, 7 different layers of, um, you know, uh, I'm trying to remember the term that they use. It's going to come to me, but they're,
See, it's happening to you too, man.
yeah,
These
I'm old
these
as
things that
well.
we
I had
know.
like 2 sips of coffee. But the basic idea, it's levels of integrity. So they look at a bunch of levels of integrity, saying like, is the setting similar to what it was? Are the materials used similar to what they were? Is the overall vibe and the appearance basically how you would have encountered it back then? And so I don't know that there's like it's got to have 2 out of 7 levels of integrity, but they
Hmm.
look at all those layers when they're evaluating whether this is legit. So like you can have you can have a really old Victorian mansion, but if it's and maybe somebody famous lived there,
Hmm.
but if it was moved and then it was burned down and rebuilt and the paint is different, then like that's not a historic building, you know?
Hmm.
It has to have some kind of like legitimate physical connection to what it was.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah, I was. It reminds me. I was several years ago. I was down. I took a swing by Hattie McDaniel's place
Hmm.
in Sugar Hill, and I was just checking it out, and it's there. And talk about. I mean, to me, that seems like a significant. Now, I don't know if there's any question of that coming down or what the deal is with that house. Although it's a cool place with a lot of history attached to it. For the listeners who don't aren't familiar with Hattie McDaniel, she's of course played Mammy in Gone with the Wind and did a bunch of other really important. The first Black actress to win an Academy Award, and it was important that she got that house there. It was kind of a big deal at the time, and she had big Hollywood parties there, and it was like a sort of a hub of cool stuff happening in the 1940s. And so that to me would be something of historical significance. Really, when I drove by it, it was in a state of I wouldn't call it dilapidated, but at the same time, it was in a state of disrepair. There were tarps over the roof, and this was years ago. I don't know if it looked like people were there working on it. So I don't know what the story is. I don't know if you know anything about what's going on with her house. But I don't know much about it, to be honest with you, from that point forward. But that, to me, is one of those kinds of places that seems like if somebody were going to knock it down and put an apartment building up, that would be a shame, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of cool history there.
I mean, there are so many buildings like that where we know that they're culturally significant.
Mm-hmm.
Like we know how important Hattie McDaniel was to Hollywood, to Los Angeles, to the Black community, everything that she
Mm-hmm.
represented. And there's a cool Hollywood Forever connection with her as
Oh
well.
yeah, totally. I love that. Yeah.
Well, kind of sad, but also like really,
It's an interesting story. It's super sad. I mean, it's an interesting story though.
yeah.
But go on. I'm sorry.
So as far as I know, that the Hattie McDaniel's house has not been locally landmarked. And what that means is that if its owner wanted to sell it and then, or if the owner wanted to demolish it, they could, with no repercussions.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not impossible to demolish something that has been locally landmarked, or nationally landmarked as well. But it puts up a lot of important stumbling blocks if something is landmarked that way. I don't see any evidence that hers has been locally landmarked. And that could mean nothing. It could just mean that it hasn't had a champion yet.
Mm-hmm.
What I hear a lot from preservationists is that you don't want to submit something for like landmark status when it's being threatened. And I mean, it happens a lot. It has to happen. I mean, this is what happened with the Marilyn Monroe house just
I
recently.
was going to ask you about that. Right.
Yeah. But it's always going to be more contentious and more difficult to get something landmarked if you know that you have forces actively opposing it already.
Mm-hmm.
So this could be a good time, for Hattie McDaniel's house to be submitted for landmark status. I'm not sure if it has been before, and it was rejected for whatever reason. But
Mm-hmm.
the
So
underlying point is like every building needs a champion for anything to happen to it landmark wise. It's not just going to happen because there's a general consensus that it's important.
right, right. And the story that you're referring to, the Hattie McDaniel story in the Hollywood Forever cemetery, for the listeners who don't know, she died of breast cancer, I think at 51, 52. I can't remember exactly the year, but of course she wanted to be buried at Hollywood Forever, which is where many extraordinarily important, significant figures in Hollywood history are interred. But of course, at the time, it was white only. And so she was denied. Is that, and then now she is actually buried in the Angeles Rosedale Cemetery. And there is at Hollywood Forever, there's a small, um, I guess, commemorative marker there by the lake that describes that. That's the story as I understand it. Is that an accurate?
I don't know that they had a policy of being whites only. What I do know
Mm-hmm.
is that the owner at the time, this guy named Jules Roth, was just a horrible caretaker of Hollywood Forever.
Mm-hmm.
He was I mean, he was a criminal, and when he got out of jail in the 30s, he bought out the other owners or stakeholders in Hollywood Forever
Mm-hmm.
for the next half century or so under his watch. Almost nothing was done to keep the place up. Headstones would
Right.
crumble. There were like famous people that had their relatives disinterred from Hollywood Forever
Mm-hmm.
because they were so concerned about what was happening there. And in addition to all that, he was also a racist. I don't know how widespread his racism went, but he was certainly prejudiced against Black people, and I think
Mm-hmm.
that's why he said no to Hattie McDaniel. But that the newer owners who have owned it since I want to say the late 90s, they've
Mm-hmm.
a remarkable job of turning around the place. And they reached out to Hattie McDaniel's estate and asked if they would like to have Hattie's remains taken from Angeles Rosedale and interred at Hollywood Forever at no charge to them. And the McDaniel family said, no, thanks. but I think it was really like one of those symbols of how the newer owners wanted to eh, change the connections that people had with the
Hmm.
cemetery.
Hmm.
They've done a
Yeah.
good.
It, cemeteries to me, and my students think I'm weird because I hang around cemeteries a lot. But I do. I love going to cemeteries because you find so many interesting little tidbits that you might not, just if you find like some of the, you go to the headstones and you go, oh, I wonder who this person is, especially if it's an elaborate headstone, it costs a lot of money. It probably means they have a lot of influence and power, potentially anyway. And you go and you look these folks up, and sure enough, you find all kinds of interesting connections
Sure.
to people way back in LA history, especially at a place like Hollywood Forever or Angeles Rosedale, cemeteries that have been there for a very long time, at least in LA terms. And so that's something that I is a kind of a weird hobby of mine, just hanging around cemeteries and taking notes.
No, I'm with you. And part of it is that there's this I recognize that, like, you can tell how rich a family is based on how elaborate the headstone is
Mm-hmm.
that they design for their deceased loved one. But there is this weird sense of like democratization of it also,
Mm-hmm.
where everybody dies. You might have, Cecil B. DeMille's tomb right next to a nobody who
Yeah.
is buried right there. They are equally dead, and
Yes, they are.
equally interesting as stories. Um, and you just stumble across anybody. The my certainly my favorite food critic, but just one of my favorite writers of all time, Jonathan Gold. He's buried at Hollywood Forever, and we were lucky enough to know him just sort of like peripherally during his
Mm-hmm.
lifetime. Uh, but I made it a mission the last time I was there to go and seek out his grave, and it's just one of these flat little gravestones, um, in a whole line of them.
Mm-hmm.
You would have to stumble across it, and it says tacos forever on it. That was his that was his big thing,
Mm-hmm.
and it's beautiful. There's so much to be uncovered at cemeteries. And I'll say also that the way that cemeteries are designed is also really fascinating to me. So my wife is interested in this also. She's
Mm-hmm.
part of an organization that of like artists and historians and writers and just interesting people that look into how our society deals with death and tries to change the conversation. Um, but the way that something like a Forest Lawn or a Hollywood Forever looks, the way that it's
Mm-hmm.
designed, the fact that it has all these beautifully landscaped areas, that's very different than the Victorian and Edwardian uh, graveyards that you found in decades and centuries prior.
Mm-hmm.
They try to acknowledge that the while there are a lot of people who are dead on our grounds, this is a place for the living. And we want people to feel more comfortable and almost de-emphasize the morbidness of it, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of history to be traced just in looking at how a Hollywood Forever is laid out. And I mean, forget about the Hollywood history. Like that's a whole another
Right.
layer of the onion, you know?
Right, right. That's really interesting. Yeah, I don't often think about. I mean, most of the cemeteries that I visit around Los Angeles are, 20th century, related to the 20th century. I mean, I've been to when I go to the East Coast, I look at a lot of military cemeteries, but those are generally, pretty well ordered, pretty standardized.
Yeah.
They are. There's a really interesting one in Richmond, though. It's called the Hollywood Cemetery, and it's not to be confused with the Hollywood Forever Cemetery. Hollywood Cemetery, right overlooking the James River in Richmond. It's just absolutely beautiful, and is a 19th century cemetery, really. And talk about ornate uh, graves. Really, I've never seen anything quite like it. It's really something spectacular. But I take my students there to see the Confederate version of what would be a national cemetery. They have all the Confederate soldiers and that were that died, especially at Gettysburg, but all throughout the war. And they have this really interesting pyramid that's built right in the middle of it that I've been trying to sort through for years and years and years. It's a really fascinating cemetery, but you can learn so much about a people and how they understand themselves and how they identify by going to cemeteries.
Mm-hmm.
So I encourage people to do it. It sounds morbid, but really, I mean, in so many ways, what you're saying is correct. You go there, and it's like kind of a park-like setting, right? So it's actually can be a rather pleasant experience, strolling around. I know during the pandemic, that was one of the few places that you could like actually go and not be around a lot of people.
Oh yeah.
Uh,
It was
so
safe to do it.
mhm, yeah. So shift gears a little bit and talk for a few minutes before I let you go. Just talk about social media, because you're very present on social media. I've been present on social media for a very long time. And in some ways, I think of social media both as a blessing and a curse. It can be a great place to meet people. I mean, you and I met on social media. Of course, it's a great place to meet people. It's a great place to exchange ideas. It's a great place to be introduced to all different kinds of perspectives, which is just a wonderful talk when you speak about the democratizing effect of something. Social media really has the potential to do that. At the same time, it can be just this, you know, the muck and in the animosity and the vitriol that's generated in what passes for, I guess, debate. And I know it's not really debate, it's just people screaming at each other. Have you run into in your travels, I mean, you have a very positive demeanor. You have, you're talking about learning about the history of LA, and you're really doing it through landmarks and stuff. And it seems to me like something people could get behind and really be encouraged by. But at the same time, everybody's going to get offended by something.
Yeah.
Everything is going to be offensive to somebody. And do you ever get pushback or criticism out in the world of social media telling you, telling you what's up?
I do. And
Mm-hmm.
it's not been often. I think my account, Etan Does LA, occupies a different niche than many others. Like, even there are plenty of people who talk about things to do around LA or like old stuff around LA. I mean, the LA in a Minute guy, Evan,
Mm-hmm.
he's had remarkable success. He's on TV right now, and he's doing LA history too. But um, because of the nature of what I'm covering, these are buildings on a list that I didn't decide on. So I have to take the famous with the non-famous. I might be the only person posting about a certain like former post office
Mm-hmm.
or a random house that doesn't even have a name, in Western Pasadena or something.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like my responsibility is to represent something accurately and well. And so I try to editorialize as little as possible in cases like that. There are people who will have attachments to a house or a neighborhood that I couldn't possibly hope to access. And so I think my role is kind of like, let me let me let me tell you what I just learned about over the past couple weeks. Is there anyone out there that has more information that you'd like to contribute to this tiny little pool of knowledge that's available about this thing?
Mm-hmm.
So, and I mean, I love when people tell me stories about like, oh, I lived just down the corner from that post office, and that used to be my post office, or I biked by this every day during the 70s. I never knew the story about it. Thanks. Um, but yes, there are occasions where even with that approach, it's gotten me some flack, and it's actually been really instructive. So, like, I'll give you an example. There is an old movie theater in, it's called the Golden Gate Theater, and I think you'd call the area just East LA.
Mm-hmm.
And it was turned into a CVS maybe a decade ago or so. And it has a really fascinating history for sure. The area right now is heavily Latino, and it didn't used to be. I mean, it was developed by a white dude. Most of the people that lived around there at the time were white as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I said something at the beginning of the video about this Golden Gate Theater, something like, if you're an LA history fan, the next time you need a bar of deodorant, go back to this old historic theater that now houses a CVS. And there was one follower who took exception to that and was like, you know, don't send all these hipster people to my like take resources away from my community. And I mean, like there are all kinds of holes in that logic.
Yeah.
I fully admit. Um, but I didn't even consider that perspective of like, oh, well, what happens if like a bunch of my followers are interested in the history of this place, but like that's all they do. You know, they're
Hmm.
almost like rapaciously going in, buying a bar of candy or not, just like walking up and down the halls, not contributing to the local economy of this area and treating this like beautiful building just as a thing to gawk at rather than an active of a community. Um, and so that was really instructive to me, honestly. Uh, And you know, there are some other things similar to that where like I did a admittedly not very good video about the Boyle Hotel in Boyle Heights. It was
Hmm.
very early on in this project when I didn't know what I was doing at all. And so a guy on YouTube was just like, stop sending people like you to, you know, my neighborhood and just talking about it. Um, there was one other, I think, more serious comment that I got when I visited the Mission San Gabriel. Archangel, which was, you know, the first mission in LA
Hmm.
and it actually predated the founding of Los Angeles as a
Hmm.
city. And it was set on fire in 2020, or the main chapel was set on fire, and they just reopened it last July. And they have this new museum there, which I think does a pretty wonderful job of balancing out the perspectives of the Spanish friars who ran the place and the Native Americans who were, you could say, enslaved and
Hmm.
forced to labor in, you know, in the mission and build the mission.
Hmm.
Uh, and so I address this. Like, I think whenever you talk about the founding of Los Angeles, you can't not seriously talk about the displacement and the piss poor treatment of the Native Americans.
Right.
Uh, So when I posted something about how well I thought it was balanced, there was somebody from the Tonga Gabrielino tribe who commented and was like, "This doesn't represent us." And so I was just like gently asking questions of her, saying like, "Hey, what in specific did you notice about the museum that um that could have been like much better or elucidating?" And she told me. And so it was a learning experience. But
So,
it's like,
in that case, in that case, I would say that's a positive experience, honestly. I mean, you're wading into contentious waters with this sort of
yeah,
thing, and this is I find this out too as a Civil War historian. I often run up against people who have very vastly different either perspectives that I do or feel that I'm not appropriately representing a perspective. And sometimes it can be instructive, like you said, and people can have a reasonable conversation. Sometimes, though, and this is, I mean, it doesn't seem like you're really running into too much of this, which is great. But sometimes, though, you run up against people who aren't interested in having a conversation so much as they are interested in ramming their agenda down your throat. And that can be a very negative experience,
well,
right?
look, I mean, part of this I chalk up to me not being a trained historian. I mean, you have a doctorate in this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
I don't
I've,
know how much that really means, but but I mean,
but you know what I mean?
okay.
Like, I in no way consider myself historian. I learn about landmarks and I think about like I'm a knowledgeable friend who has done a little bit more reading and research about each of these places than you might have. And so like let's start a conversation. Um, and so like if I try to maintain that mindset that like I'm not the be all and end all of this, then I think that's actually pretty disarming to anyone who comes in with an agenda. I'll just
Mm-hmm.
ask them, hey, what's your story with this place? And they'll tell me, and the argument is over. But you're right. It's like there are going to be folks who just every old building that looks a little dilapidated that I post about, someone will comment, you know, it's so depressing that we don't care about our history. Or, you know, screw all the developers who are just like holding on to these old buildings and not doing anything with them.
Mhm.
And it's like, I agree with the spirit of that, but there's all kinds of economic and political and cultural forces that are feeding into why that building is in the state of disrepair that it is. And it's hard to have a productive conversation uh, with an anonymous personage on social media and not like spend your entire day. So that's part of it. Like, I have a full-time job and a family. I'm
Right.
doing this passion project. I
Mhm.
know some stuff, but you also have to, you know, you you got to pick your battles, Keith. You
No,
know?
hey, I couldn't agree with you more. And something that you said, I think, is really super important. And I think, I mean, okay, yeah. So, I mean, I've got the historian credentials. That doesn't make me the no end all final word on anything either. And one of the most liberating moments I've ever had as an academic, as a scholar, was the day that it occurred to me that I didn't really I might be wrong about everything that I've ever said ever, you know. And if somebody has evidence to counter the things that I've said and the things that I believe and the things that I hold to be sacred or true or what have you, and I've got to listen to that, right? So you, I think, have some really great a great attitude about this, first of all, and some great advice to everybody. Uh, People who are do this as passion projects and who are just fascinated by history, and also people who can, I guess, you know, assume the credentialed version of historian. I honestly, I don't know if there's all that much. You know, we have pieces of paper. I don't, whatever. But some people take that stuff more seriously, I think, than I do. I did once, but I don't anymore. The whole PhD thing.
Well, look,
But
I think that what you get when you
mhm.
are schooled in an academic setting is you understand the approach, right? You understand the research methodology.
Yes,
And also, like, I'm hoping that what you learn and what you impart to your students is critical thinking, just
yeah,
like not taking every fact as that you encounter as a given, or even if everything you've read happens to be true, like wondering who is telling those specific facts,
mhm.
who gets to decide who tells the history. You know, that's one of the great gifts of Lin-Manuel Miranda in Hamilton. It's like
Right,
he asked that question right in the show, you know.
mhm.
uh, and so like that it's that critical eye that I think is so crucial, both for the work that I'm doing in my own research, but also if you're looking at the world of social media. It's like there's just so much drivel out there, and even well-intentioned drivel, you know.
Mhm.
It's like I'm glad that people are asking questions of me because it makes my research more watertight. I'll give you a stupid little example. So I was doing I did a piece on the Rose Bowl, and I don't care about sports, but there's an architect named Myron Hunt who is a terrific architect and did a lot of great stuff around LA, um, especially in the Pasadena area. And he designed it. And when I went on the tour there, they took us through this passageway that like one of the teams runs through, you know, before entering the field every single game.
Mhm.
And the tour guide pointed out the walls, which are they're kind of this textured concrete that look like boards, like wooden boards. And
Mhm.
what she told us was that these are the actual boards that were put there in, you know, the 19, I'm trying to remember when it was built, 19 teens, early 1920s, something like that. Um, and they were covered over in a layer of concrete. So it sort of like preserves what this section of the Rose Bowl used to look like in a very concrete, pardon the pun, way.
Mhm.
And so I said something about that as sort of the stinger in my video. And then somebody more knowledgeable than me pointed out like, hey, that's not the actual boards. It's they have this thing called board formed concrete where they would put up like a framing of boards, wooden boards, pour the concrete inside it, wait for it to set, and then take the boards out. And so
Mhm.
what you're seeing is really just the imprint of those boards as the concrete was drying. And it's like it's a subtle thing, but it's also, if you know more than I do about like construction methods, it's like a pretty basic mode of construction back in the day
Right.
that I'm glad I know about it now, even though if somebody has to call me out on it first, you know?
Well, Larry, that's the beautiful thing of being able to have instantaneous contact with so many people is that
Yeah.
when you do make those little mistakes or don't get it exactly right or aren't as complete as you could be, there's people around and there's constructive ways to talk about that.
Yeah, for
But
sure.
but I think that's a good place to end. On this note of thinking critically about stuff, which by the way is the foundation of everything that I do as a teacher. So, and I'm glad that we see eye to eye on that because I think it's so necessary these days, especially to be critical about everything that we see and read and hear. So thanks for that, and also Etan, thank you for coming to the show. I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. Now had our we've had our thing, and I'm very pleased. So I appreciate you coming on the show, man. Thanks.
Such a joy. Thanks for the invitation.
Yes, sir.
Take care. Happy Memorial Day.
Happy Memorial Day.